Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the first of our, well, it's not the first of our 2021 virtual events, but it is the first of our autumn series. And I don't know whether it's by popular demand or just we've had quite good take up of these seminars over last autumn and spring. And as promised pre-harvest, we said we'd be back. So here we are. Thank you all for joining. We're a couple of minutes early, so we'll wait for everybody to log in and get started. Obviously, we've had harvest. We've had a huge amount of economic upheaval going on at the moment. From fertilizer being £650 a tonne to fuel and one thing and another. So we've got plenty to think about, but tonight we're going to talk about the farming rules for water, which I was going to say it was thrown at us in July, but that's not the case. As we'll learn tonight, we've had these farming rules for a while, and really what we're trying to establish is how best as an industry we can deal with them across a whole range of scenarios. So welcome everybody back to the autumn webinars, and just to let you know, we are going to run these now throughout the autumn and winter on a monthly basis, and just keep an eye on your TFA news, emails and so on for future dates, and I'll mention a few of those towards the end. Just a few housekeeping things. All of these webinars are recorded and edited and then available on our TFA YouTube channel, as well as within the news section of the TFA website. So if you want to share them with anybody or watch them back on demand, or heaven forbid you fall asleep after half an hour, you can watch the second half. But please do share it. And we've had, I think I'm right in saying, Julie reported to me, as many people watching these live and then going back and watching on demand. So that's a really good thing. Secondly, we have a few questions that people have sent in that we'll file to the panelists as we go. Sorry, not as we go, as we've heard their presentations. But if you have got questions on the night, hopefully on your Zoom options, you can see there's a Q&A button in mine. It's at the middle at the bottom. So if you could put any questions in there, and between George and myself, we'll try and filter those through so that everybody has a chance to ask questions. Apologies already if we don't get around to them all, because we may well not to. I'm also pleased to say that we're very fortunate that Barclays have once again sponsored the webinar series, and as many of you will know, Barclays are big supporters of the TFA, and we're very pleased that they've continued to offer support for these webinars. It's a big help to the organisation, and we're very appreciative of it. So without further ado, let's sort of get things underway a little bit. As I say, we're going to talk about the farming rules for water, and there's been extensive commentary on the implications of the new farming rules for water, particularly in respect to the application of organic manure. And the recently issued 1st of August, I think it came into place, regular position statement from the Environment Agency. So this evening is a chance to hear from the Environment Agency itself as to what it believes the rules require and how it foresees these rules being implemented in the months and years that lie ahead. And I'm particularly interested to understand the logic for it, because I think the direction of travel may well be the right way to go. However, I think we need to sort of understand the evidence, and that's because perhaps I haven't read enough about it. So I'm really interested to hear that tonight. So we'll also debate and discuss whether the Environment Agency stance is both legally and practically sound. As somebody who contract spreads quite a bit of manure and stuff, the practicality, obviously I'm very keen on the legal element, but the practicality of it is of particular interest. And we'll also look to get some answers to your members' questions and the practical implications on your farming business. So I'm really pleased this evening to welcome Dr. Kevin Austin, who's the Deputy Director of the Environment Agency, where he leads leads on agriculture, fisheries, and the natural environment, which seems like a huge portfolio. So I'm very pleased and we're very happy that you've listening. He previously worked for the Welsh Government in a number of roles, including head of the Agricultural Strategy and Policy Unit, where he oversaw the development of new sustainable land management schemes, negotiations with the EU on transposing environmental directives, and the introduction of the Agriculture Sector Wales Act. And in between roles, he has worked overseas, coordinating scientific surveys in Cyprus and helping to develop a national strategy for sustainable agriculture in Zambia. And I hope you'll enjoy this evening, Kevin, and we won't drive you back to Zambia after an hour. So, although maybe Zambia is a better place to be than the wind and rain of North Lincolnshire. Kevin will outline the Environment Agency current position, and he will be followed by Sam Godfrey, who, again, we're very happy that Sam's had the time to come and talk to us tonight, and has been very involved in the development of the Farming Rules for Water Industry Working Group. He's a third-generation pig and arable farmer, based in Lincolnshire and East Yorkshire. Funnily enough, farms right next door to me, or Sam not necessarily himself, but they have land right next door to us. They have 6,500 farrowing sows, sows to finishers, sorry, and 11,000 acres. He's been a member of the Farming Rules for Water Industry Working Group and is heavily involved in several issues which involve disputes in the matter of the interpretation of the law with the Environment Agency, including the Somerby top appeal against the environmental permit condition regarding local wildlife sites, which went on to set a precedent which the Environment Agency have followed ever since. Sam's also a member of the National Pig Association's policy group. However, he's attending this evening's debate as a farmer in his own right and not as a pig association representative. But as I say, Sam's been very involved, as we are as an organisation, with the Farming Rules for Water Industry Group. So very grateful for both Kevin and Sam giving their time this evening to speak to us. And I think without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Kevin to get us started. So welcome, Kevin.
Thank you very much, Mark, for that introduction, and thank you very much also to George for inviting me to come and talk. I think these events are an excellent idea, and it was great to come along to explain the EA's position. I'm just getting a little bit of reverb, actually, so I'm going to turn off my video to see if that helps a bit. Yeah, so I know there are loads of difficult issues facing farmers at the moment. Mark touched on them at the outset, and there are particularly unique challenges that face tenant farmers. I'm here to talk, of course, about farming rules for water, and particularly the issues around Rule 1 and the regulatory position statement more recently. I hope to explain the developments to offer some reassurance as much as anything. So I hope to explain the developments as they progressed to offer some reassurance, I hope, as much as anything, and also debunk a few myths that are flying around, one of which actually Mark's kindly already addressed, which was actually that the farming rules for water are new, that they've been in place since 2018. But I guess first I'll talk about why the farming rules are here in the first place. I'm sure it won't have escaped your attention that water quality is really high on the agenda at the moment. The picture's actually not quite so bad as the press will have it. We've seen some really big improvements in some sectors we regulate. We've also seen, obviously, some really polluting heavy industries decline in recent years. But we still face some massive challenges. Just to explain some of those to you, we've got a task force with the water industry on combined storm overflows, which empty sewage into rivers at high flow. It's estimated it's going to cost about 100 billion or more in investment to address that one completely, but we're making a start. And in rural areas, obviously, we also know there are other issues beyond farming too, including septic tanks, for example. I guess the fundamental data behind the farming rules for water, though, is that the primary cause of water quality failures, according to our monitoring, in the largest number of rivers, is still diffuse pollution from farming. And that's why government chose to introduce the regs in 2018. And beyond that, and particularly pertinent to today's conversation, is that the data behind the diffuse pollution tells us that the biggest cause of that diffuse pollution itself is application of excess nutrients beyond the requirements. And that's why DEFRA introduced Rule 1 covering crop need, nutrient planning and soil testing. And in consulting and introducing the regs, DEFRA advised that their aim was to bring relevant elements of codes of practice and agronomic advice into law. So the EA doesn't set the regulations, we implement them. And we followed this direction for Rule 1 and crop need. We considered the original references in the codes of practice, which talked about, in particular, a limited need for nitrogen in many situations in autumn and winter, which was subsequently described into kind of agronomic advice manuals, I suppose, and most recently has also appeared in RB 209, which AHDB produced. Another myth I'd like to debunk is that this originated as a problem because of AHDB. It had nothing to do with that. They just drew across stuff that was already written up. We also looked, of course, at the code of practice for sewage sludge in agriculture, which has been a big part of the issues that we found on the ground, and that also applies to producers and users, and was published in conjunction, more or less, with farming rules for water. And that also talks about ensuring that applications occur at the time crops can make best use of them. So that's why timing has been part of our implementation. And from time to time, we check in with government as to the references we should apply to, and we ascertain from them that timing of applications absolutely was consistent, if you like, with the legislation as they viewed their intention for us to regulate it. And I think DEFRA have confirmed that to the industry too. We've been implementing on that basis, and I want to make this clear, we've been implementing on that basis since 2018. We don't do a huge amount of farm visits. Our focus tends to be on infrastructure, but we've done 420 visits on farming rules. Our visits are highly targeted based on where the bad water quality is, based on remote sensing, complaints from the farming community, including, you might be quite surprised actually, quite often from other farmers. We go where we expect to find problems. So give you an idea, for slurry storage, our most recent targeted visits in the south of England found 75% non-compliance with SAFO. But for Rule 1, we've actually not found it to be such a big deal. So and even within Rule 1, which governs not just excess crop need, but also testing and nutrient plans, we found that most of the breaches have been for not having the soil testing that's required and for not having done the nutrient planning. Less than 10% breaches for actually excessive crop need. And in fact, the cases we have picked up have been in some instances so high that the applications could arguably be said to be captured under the waste permitting regulations that we also apply. So we've taken an advice-led approach. We've generally found workarounds for the farmers in question. We had to find workarounds for the anaerobic digestate producers who were spreading very high nutrient stuff. We've issued a few warning letters in single digits, but we've not actually had to prosecute anybody. So I guess you're asking maybe why was the need for the regulatory position statement? So earlier this year, we were approached separately by Water UK and NFU. Both water companies were concerned some farmers weren't taking sewage sludge, and NFU were concerned that some farmers were refusing material from other farmers. It was queried whether we were misapplying the rule, and we said we were open to compelling evidence that was the case. We didn't ever actually receive anything back, and I think both organisations spoke to government too. Instead, what both organisations did do was commission ADAS, actually, who did some really interesting research. And they showed that actually if you swapped all autumn applications to spring applications, you would get some pollution swapping risks, higher phosphate, potentially greater air pollution. I think from our perspective, that's fine, but we weren't looking to swap. We weren't finding that many issues. We're not looking to swap the huge amount of activity, and actually the workarounds we've been developing have often not required moving the applications to spring. So it raised important points though, and it needed further looking at. When we met then with an industry group in June, I said I was happy to continue exploring this issue of the science around our implementation of the regs to check whether it was practical and sustainable. But as an additional concession, I said, if you really have got problems, and they were saying they were, we would look favourably, if you like, at a request for a regulatory easement. And I think that's called a regulatory position statement. And I guess that's another myth I'd like to debunk. It wasn't the EA that kind of voluntarily brought this forward. It was a request from the industry. And we eventually, in kind of mid-July, had a couple of requests for RPSs from both water companies and NFU, and with an additional really urgent request that they were in place by the end of July, with risks for overtopping stores and sewage sludge having to be stored in public. So just to give you a sense of what an RPS means, it means we're telling government we can't apply the regs. It needs drafting, it needs legal due diligence, it requires our executive team to approve it, it requires EU board notification, it requires notification of government officials in case they wish to brief ministers, and following that it requires submission to DEFRA. By way of context, I was offline during the COVID first wave, and I was doing RPSs for such unpleasant things like mortuary extensions and excess hours running for crematoria and that sort of stuff, and they were taking a good few weeks. So I was being bombarded by requests from NFU. When are we getting this RPS? When are we going to get this RPS? And I will put my hands up and say straight away, it was not our finest hour done in such a rush. It wasn't particularly clear. We didn't have the opportunity in that rush to properly consult over risk criteria and stuff. And that is my ultimate responsibility. But we did move heaven and earth to get it out to the industry's deadline. And we also, we were able to use that to then give a comfort letter to water companies to then contact all of their farmers and say they can spread their stuff this autumn and winter. We've had hundreds of messages from farmers saying they want to adopt the RPS and use it for their spreading this autumn and winter. So although it wasn't a great communication, it has met the purpose, if you like, that we were bringing it in for, to address those immediate concerns and the reason why we were asked for it. What do I view as the way forward? Because that was one of the things that Mark introduced. We've initiated an industry working group. You've heard Sam's on it. Our suggestion, and this is what I'd said in June, is that we want to look at what is the best sustainable approach going forward. And it might not be farming rules for water, or it might be that we change our approach to farming rules for water. I've said that can be an independent evaluation. It doesn't have to be from the EA. So we're open to views on who that should be, as long as they've got the right expertise. That could inform revisions to how EA implements the regs. It could be around timing of applications. It could be the concept of acceptable losses. We're really, really open-minded to that. And also, briefing Minister Prentice, I also said, depending on the findings, maybe there'll be a need for regulatory change. I'd also say both her officials and her are really equally open-minded about that too. So the partnership offer goes beyond that, actually. If we need a replacement RPS next year, I've said we'll work with the industry to make sure we can get it a bit better next time around. And I also would hope we could work together in communicating, because I think that's been half of the problem here, that this came as a bit of a surprise to people. And crucially, I also think the working group gives a really powerful opportunity to jointly kind of put forward strong arguments for the kind of support, both capital and around the land management schemes during agriculture transition, that can help deliver better outcomes for both water and indeed for farm productivity. So a part of all of this work, we'd really like to spend a bit more time also talking informally to farmers about the situations you face, what you're trying to do, understand where the problems are. So I also extend an offer out to George to set up an event with our technical people to sit down with members and hear a little bit more about actually what it's like on the ground. I'm not a technical person, by the way. In the meantime, our area teams, by the way, are under direction to continue to focus only where there are very, very clear-cut risks and to maintain that advice-led approach. We're not reaching for the prosecution book. So I think I'll just close by saying, you know, I've worked with the sector for 20 years now, advisor, civil servant, EA. There's certainly been plenty of difficult moments in that time, as you'll remember and can imagine. But I think I've always been able to operate in a spirit of partnership, and I really hope you can understand we have been trying to act in good faith through this whole process, and that is certainly with the hand we've been dealt what we're continuing to try to do. So thank you very much for listening. I look forward to answering some of your questions, hearing from Sam, and engaging in a bit of a debate later.
Kevin, thank you very much for that. And as ever, it's always good to hear from the horse's mouth, as it were. Please take that as a compliment rather than a slight. But yeah, it's really good to hear that. And I think possibly one of the things you've hit on the head there was there's a lot of technical issues that we do need to understand, I think, around this. But I think perhaps it's a lesson for a lot of us in that communication is key in this, and there's certainly been a few errors on that front, I think. So, but thank you very much for that information and presentation. Really interesting, and I think that will spark a few questions and to come at you shortly. So I'm going to just keep things moving. So I'm going to go straight on to Sam, who's really, as we said earlier, is coming at this very much from a farmer's perspective, so not necessarily with his MPA hat on. And I think hopefully we're going to hear quite a bit about the legal and practical issues that we think have arisen as a result of what sort of happened in the summer. So I'll just go straight on, hand over to you, Sam. So welcome.
Thank you very much, Mark, and thanks to George and the TFA for having me tonight. And I should just say that that's the most humble I've ever heard Dr. Austin sound. It's not necessarily quite like that when you sit in the industry working group, but I shall come to that in time. So I'll just give you a slightly different perspective to Dr. Austin on how I have seen these rules come about. As everyone has said, Mark and Dr. Austin, the rules came in 2018. They aren't new. Prior to them coming in, as with all legislation, there was a detailed consultation process. I'm sure everyone on the call tonight would have responded to that in full, as you always do. And the rules themselves came to force in April 2018. And I'm sure you remember at the time that there was no fireworks and no fanfare to the rules coming in. And the question is, why? Why was there no outcry from farmer organisations in April 2018 when the rules came in? Why didn't DEFRA and the Environment Agency really push to make farmers understand quite how revolutionary these rules were going to be? I'll come back to these questions a bit later. But the first part to answering them is to ask another question. What did the Environment Agency and DEFRA actually say about the rules at the time they came in? DEFRA published a policy paper in October 2017 and they updated it in March 2018. The Environment Agency have a river basin management plan published in October 2019, which covers these regulations. And of course, far more formally and officially, there were two impact assessments on these regulations, one published with the consultation and one published post-consultation. I'll just quote from the one that was published with the consultation. As separate regulations exist to tackle nitrate pollution, further rules on nitrate are not part of the proposed regulatory change. In fact, none of those documents mention the revolution that the Environment Agency now say was in the legislation all along. So when did that view that there was no major change on nitrate applications, including nitrate involved in organic materials, when did that attitude from the Environment Agency and DEFRA start to change? The first mention of this I can find is in an Environment Agency guidance note from July 2019. The nutrient needs of each farm and field can be different in terms of what is required and when to meet crop and soil needs. That's the first mention of timing I can find, but it doesn't actually say you can't apply in the autumn. It certainly doesn't say you can't apply in the autumn to meet the needs of the crop later in the year. There's also a quote from that guidance: ensure that nutrients must only be applied at a time when they will be needed by the crop and soil, by the soil and a crop on that land. Now that sounds a bit scarier until you realise what it actually says. Ensure these nutrients must only be applied at a time when they will be needed, i.e. prior to them being needed. That can be in the autumn for spring. No issue there. I think we agree with that. The Environment Agency began to raise the stakes in late 2020, early 2021. There's some letters began to be circulated to select farmers, not widespread, select farmers and farming representative organisations, which stated, the Environment Agency finds that according to the RB 209, there is no agronomic justification for crop available nutrient applications, particularly of nitrogen, to many crops in the autumn. That's a deliberately selective reading of RB 209. It doesn't counter the industry's case, but it is the first hint we have that the Environment Agency viewed this as a ban of autumn applications of organic materials ahead of winter cereals. And then, of course, the notorious regulatory position statement. Published on the 3rd of August 2021, that introduced entirely new definitions of pollution and effectively became a ban on autumn applications. Now there was industry outrage, and as Dr. Austin indicated in his talk, they were forced to hastily backtrack and publish an update 3 weeks later. This update asked farmers to seek approval from the Environment Agency for their autumn applications. Dr. Austin says they had hundreds. Really, it should have been thousands. That was largely ignored. I'm afraid that the Environment Agency's credibility as a regulator was shot by that point, and they need some level of recovery. So they came asking the industry for help. They formed the industry working group to discuss enforcement of the regulations. The problem with this, when we all joined this industry working group, was that their starting position was, you're all a bunch of criminals, now cooperate. And the lines we were given to cooperate on were very, very narrow. So the industry said, well, could you just drop this accusation that we're all criminals? And we got a point blank refusal from the Environment Agency, and to be fair, that was backed up by DEFRA. But I don't think it's an unreasonable thing to ask that you drop the accusation that we're criminals. I don't think it's a big thing to ask, and I think it is the reason that that's stalled, and I think the blame lies at the foot of the Environment Agency and DEFRA. So, having whistled through how we got where we got, what does the regulation actually say? It's up there on my slide. The key part is 41AI. That's the key part of the regulation that we disagree over. A land manager must ensure that for each application of organic manure or manufactured fertilizer to agricultural land, the application is planned so that it does not exceed the needs of the soil and crop on that land. So if I move to the next slide, you can see what the Environment Agency's interpretation of that is. They say that because Section 4 of RB 209 says that many crops, for many crops, section by section, says that there is no requirement for seed bed nitrogen and that organic materials contain nitrogen. If you apply them in the autumn when the crop does not need them, then you are exceeding the crop need. That sounds to me like a revolution that we can't achieve. It seems very odd that there hasn't been an outcry up to now. Surely that's not right, and you'll be pleased to know, if we move to the next slide, that it isn't. And I should just say at this point that I am not a lawyer and I'm not qualified to give legal advice, so please do speak to your own solicitors about this in preference to me, and certainly speak to your solicitor in preference to the Environment Agency. According to regulation for our interpretation as an industry, according to regulation 41AI, each application is planned so that it does not exceed the needs of the soil on the crop on that land. And as you can see, there's no mention of timing in that regulation at all. The regulations don't preclude an autumn application of organic material to meet the spring crop of a need, the spring need of a crop. And if you look at RB 209, you'll see that section 2 of RB 209 has a series of tables which show that nitrogen applied as part of organic materials in the autumn will be available to meet the need of the crop in spring, entirely in line with regulation 41AI, or Rule 1 as it's commonly known. You should, however, do a risk assessment and make sure you plan this properly. The risk factors are listed in regulation 42. So obviously you can't go next to a dike or near a borehole, but I don't think there's much disagreement between the industry and the Environment Agency about those conditions in regulation 42. So who is right? I think I've probably answered the question as to who I think is right, but there really isn't any doubt at all that the industry interpretation is right. If something isn't expressly prohibited, if the regulation doesn't actually say that we can't, that you've got to apply in the autumn for a need in the autumn, then there isn't a prohibition from the regulations. The wording of the regulation is entirely deliberate. As I've already covered, and as Dr. Austin covered, there was a consultation prior to these regulations, and I said that we all contributed. Well, some of us did, and we saw very clearly that the result of that consultation was that the regulations were deliberately worded not to prohibit autumn applications to meet a spring need. And we know this even more explicitly than that. Not only were we involved in the consultation, that the impact assessment says that for farmers in NVZs, the only additional impact of Rule 1 is additional soil sampling. Now, Dr. Austin said that not everyone is complying with that. Unfortunately, I think he's right that we do have to comply with that, but that is the only additional requirement for farmers from Rule 1 for farmers who are in Rule Zs, in NVZs. And as I think everybody knows, NVZ closed periods don't prohibit autumn applications of organic materials, depending on your soil type. There is a closed period, but it doesn't cover the entirety of autumn, certainly not August and largely not September. That impact assessment is still available, and in fact, it's explicitly referred to in the explanatory note at the foot of the regulation. So there's little doubt that would be used to interpret the regulation. So we can be fairly clear that is how it would be interpreted. And furthermore, we do know that had DEFRA wanted to ban that explicitly, they would have done so. They know how to write legislation that says that, because they've done exactly that in the nitrates regulations for manufactured fertilizer. If they'd wanted to ban autumn applications of organic materials, they could have lifted that clause from the nitrates regulations and added the words "and organic materials" next to manufactured fertilizer, and we would have had no argument. The fact that they didn't do that is it's not just a strong indication, it's pretty clear that ban does not exist. Which leads us to the practical implications. Shouldn't we be looking to move autumn applications to spring anyway? Well, Dr. Austin's mentioned the ADAS report that was done by the industry in spring. It really was the answer to the wrong question, because the regulation covers water pollution. But I think from a practical and reasonable and an overall perspective, you can see that it's not necessarily sensible to move everything from autumn to spring, because there are numerous other pollution issues from moving autumn applications to spring: ammonia, nitrate runoff, phosphate runoff, soil compaction, odor implications. Also, I mean, just having one application window would just generally carry a higher level of risk due to soil conditions, and we know that that's certainly something you have to take account of in the farming rules for water. And it's just not a practical way forward. So I'm grateful for Dr. Austin for opening the door to regulatory change. I'm always happy to talk about that, but I don't think it's necessary, because I think it's pretty clear that the regulations don't actually ban autumn applications for a spring need. So, I mean, that's all I've really got to say on it. I think it's fairly cut and dry, without being a lawyer or issuing legal advice. And please don't try and say that I've given you advice, because I don't fancy the court cases arising from it. Thanks very much.
Thanks for Sam. And you've hit quite a few nails on the head from I think probably from a practical farming perspective as much as else. Don't worry, we won't be blaming you for giving legal advice in the future. So you can rest easy in your bed tonight. I think there's a couple of things I'd just like to pick up, perhaps with Kevin on that from what Sam has said, and maybe you could just clarify these, Kevin. The first is where one of the issues, perhaps I should say, is that is whether there's a real issue with the regulation that it outlaws the autumn application of organic manure if we think there is a spring need in the crop. Where are the EA on that? Because that seems to me to be absolutely critical, because one of the, as Sam explained, I think, a lot of us will apply organic manures for a crop need to a winter crop that may be used over the course of quite a long period. So where is the sort of definitive EA stance on that?
So let's just come back to the legal side of it then, because it's quite technical, and I'm like Sam, I'm not a lawyer, and I'm also aware, I can't go into too much detail. So I've told you where we took our direction from, which was the codes of practice, which is what DEFRA said in consulting on the regs should be our guidance in terms of where we should go to. Now, and as I said, DEFRA have confirmed that was their intention. But what I can't do is go into too much more detail around those legal aspects, because actually, breaking news for you, as of today, I've had news of an impending legal challenge on that point. So it looks like it's going to be tested in court anyway, and you'll appreciate I'm under direction not to go into too much detail around a legal case that's almost live. But on that point, I think what I would try to get across, Mark, is actually the practical approach that we've been applying in implementing the regs for 3 years. The small number of farms that we've actually picked up, we've been taking a really risk-based approach. We're not interested here in blocking autumn production period, autumn spreading period at all. The numbers, if nothing else, demonstrate that. What we're trying to achieve is mostly to really prevent the really highly available nitrate stuff going down in autumn and winter, when there isn't a crop need at that point, because there isn't a crop in situ, or there isn't going to be the land bank to take it. So we've been doing things like, asking farmers to disperse it over a wider land bank. Some cases, yes, moving it to spring, but not always. And then the reason for that is, you'll be well aware that what our winters are like. It's been wet, it's been cold, it's getting wetter and more extreme. We see a huge spike of nitrates in rural streams over that winter period. So, that's, as a regulator, we're there to try to obviously prevent that pollution. That's what we're seeing. We're really going in to the farms where the rivers are actually failing and where the really high risk activity is. Sam's incorrect that this kind of blew up with a letter this year. It really blew up, and we were having quite a lot of dialogue with NFU back in 2019 when we investigated in quite a lot of detail what was happening with the anaerobic digestate sector. So a lot of food waste that then gets spread onto farmland. Now that's really high available nitrate, and that's one of the areas that, as I say, it's effectively almost waste in terms of the level of nutrients that were going down, waste permitting almost conditions. So that's what we've been trying to do. And I would have liked to have been able to consult a bit more around the kind of risk criteria we brought in with the RPS. But more fundamentally, I'm open, and I've said I'm open to the working group back in June, before Sam joined it, to looking at a more, a sustainable approach which looks at all of those issues around pollution swapping, and also whether or not, issues like building organic manures, building soil organic content, how the best way is to achieve those things. But we have to work with the regs we're given, and we have to work with how we think legally they are directing us to act, and that's what we've done.
Okay, well, yeah, no, I understand that, Kevin. But I guess that probably feeds a little bit into one of the one of the questions we've had from one of our members in Herefordshire, and I think has been quite widely triggered, if you like, or raised around this issue since the summer, which is that the Environment Agency stance seems to be contrary to the wider stance of the government in looking to improve soil quality and to reduce carbon footprint of agriculture, given that a lot of farmers have over the last whatever number of years, and certainly as biosolids and I guess digestate have become more available to us, have been using more organic manures, and this seems to discourage, I'll say discourage rather than ban, which is the wording in the question I'm given, because I don't think it's banned, but the implication or the interpretation is that it is. And so the unintended consequence of that is that you're very likely to push people down the route of using inorganic fertilizers and not using organic fertilizer. And it seems to be contrary to where we're directed with ELMS and DEFRA's wider stance. Can you sort of comment on how that all fits together?
Yeah, we've had these questions, is this going to block regenerative farming, and those, does this work against organics? There are, of course, a whole load of ways that you can build soil organic matter in the autumn without applying a readily available nitrate application. And I think that would be my primary answer to you. We are looking at issues here which have been around readily available nitrates, where it's going to leach out rapidly into the watercourses, or more fundamentally, where actually far too much is being put on the land anyway. So it would exceed the need of the crop, even if we were saying that even if the crop is waiting till spring for it, it would even exceed the need then. So farmers placing 100% of the crop need down in the winter, but then basically adding another 75% of crop need in the spring because it's effectively all ended up in the river. So they're the kind of issues we're picking up on. Things like composting, cover crops, etc. There are all sorts of ways to incorporate organic matter, but so it's definitely not a ban on that, and we definitely think it's consistent with ELMS. We are, as I say, open to this sustainable approach, and independent kind of agronomic experts or whatever looking at this and saying, well, what's the best balance and getting it right? Because it might be we can allow more than we're allowing at the moment. And we're happy to update a risk-based implementation to our regs, or as I say, if it feels more difficult than that legally, then the ministers said, let's rethink the rules. So we're really, really open to that.
So to a degree, my interpretation of that, Kevin, would be that what we've been doing between 2018 and 2021 even, and you mentioned earlier that the incidents where you are called out to, serious breaches, which I think it's very clear that the industry as a whole is very much supportive in getting rid of people, or not getting rid of people, but in dealing with situations where there are clear breaches and clear pollution incidents, that in actual fact, where we seem to have got to is somewhere that we need to get to, because we were actually in the very main applying these manures in the winter in a responsible and managed manner, planned manner anyway, as Sam has kind of interpreted the rule as.
So I think there is a percentage of poor behaviour that we think is causing high environmental risk, and I explained that we think that percentage is not that great, and we'll continue to tackle that when we get the opportunity to, and we'll continue to do that in an advice-led way. I think that we do need this because, as I say, the biggest environmental risk is actually coming from excess nutrient application. So there's clearly a need. That's what's causing the spikes in nutrients in the winter and the failures in terms of the water quality. So there are clearly still instances of excess nutrients being applied, and that's what we've been gradually, if you like, picking up on.
Okay. Well, which is kind of a risk-based approach. Sam, did you want to comment on kind of come back to us on there?
Well, I mean, it all sounds very reasonable, but it's not the message that has been given outside of this forum, I'm afraid. I do agree with you that total excess, that's quite a clear breach of the legislation, and I'm not here to defend that. And you know, I do understand that the Environment Agency has to prosecute where the total crop need is exceeded. You've said before that you're open to looking at changes, and you're not looking to do pollution swapping, and you're open-minded about that. But certainly the message that came back to me from the representative bodies that I'm involved in from the June working group meeting were very much that the ADAS report was presented to the group and rejected by the Environment Agency, who wanted a narrow focus on water pollution and the farming rules for water. And the third thing is that you stated here that you believe there's only minor non-compliance, which would be great, except that is firmly not the message we're getting back from DEFRA, and I think you were copied into the email from the senior policy advisor, who called it widespread non-compliance, which obviously I object to.
I'm not going to comment on a DEFRA official's email, Sam, for obvious. You'll appreciate that. I kind of lost my thread there. You know, the June meeting we had with the industry, I think there had been some misunderstanding around the communication of the ADAS report, Sam. You know, I think, but I was very clear in June. The first thing I said, I chaired that meeting, and I said, the ADAS report raises some interesting questions, and that's why I said I'm open to an independent evaluation of a more sustainable approach. That's actually what, for example, the National Pig Association kind of published lines along those afterwards. You know, what we want to do is work with the EA on coming up with a more sustainable approach going forward. I think you said the same things after the regulatory position statement too, initially. Let
me assure you, I'm not here on behalf of the Pig Association, but I'm not sure that's what they did say.
I can quote you if you want, Sam. I got it in front of me, but I won't embarrass you.
No embarrassment. I've made it very clear I'm not here representing.
Okay. I've just got an interesting question, just to sort of move on a little bit maybe, but I think very much on sort of at the root of this. Somebody's popped a question in saying, when was the scientific data that the regulation change is based on? And further to that, with the recent changes to climate and milder winters, does that make the data that the regulation is based on less valid?
That's a really good question from your member. The data, we collect monitoring data on a kind of cyclical basis. So a particular river might not be monitored every year, but we'll be collecting it over a period of time. So the data that would have informed the regulations themselves would have been collected anything from 1 year before to sort of 3 or 4 years before. But it tends to be kind of trend data, and you can see where the overall position is, I guess. And has the data changed subsequently since then? Unfortunately, I think the real message is at the moment on diffuse water pollution is it's been fairly, it's not got worse, but it's been, even with the wet winters and things, it's been fairly static. We do obviously, as you completely expect, farming will be more leaky when we get wetter winters, and it will be less leaky when we get drier winters, and we get less pollution incidents then, and we get less diffuse pollution.
So why is there no correlation between areas that are designated as NVZs and high rainfall areas? In fact, the correlation is inverse.
I think, well, for my sins, as Mark mentioned in the intro, I was around when we were kind of transcribing EU directives, including going to negotiate in Brussels for the derogation on behalf of the GB, part of GB. My understanding is that a lot of the stuff around NVZs also depends around growing season and things, and climate as well, Sam. So I think it's slightly complicated and a very detailed technical answer. And I think I wouldn't try to expand on that one here in case I got it wrong. But I'm happy to come back and provide an answer of any questions that we're not able to cover in the time we've got available today, if that would be helpful.
Okay, we've not made it clear, Kevin, but I just want to, I'm being just pressed a little bit on, can you perhaps be very clear about what circumstances you think an application would be reasonable for a crop need in the spring?
Again, Mark, I offered George a highly technical person to come here today, but he definitely wanted somebody from the kind of more from the executive side of the EA. So I'm not really comfortable with diving into too much of the technical detail, but I would be more than happy, as I said at the end of my talk, to set up a meeting for the TFA with technical experts on my side, so they can actually dive into the detail of that.
Okay, I think that would probably be actually really useful, because I think when we're talking about practicalities here, and certainly talking to peers around the area and members within the TFA, I think one of the things that's been raised by the issues that we've had over the summer is the lack of clarity about what is and isn't acceptable. And it is interesting to hear you say that clearly we don't want no one's in favour of people breaching and causing serious pollution issues. But given that I think you're saying that the number of issues that you're having on an annual basis are relatively low, not minor, low, which we all want to eliminate, it would suggest that the vast majority of us are applying or have been applying these organic manures through the autumn without causing serious pollution. Am I jumping to a conclusion that isn't there?
I think you're right to suggest that we are not seeing, for a large proportion of the farms we've been out to visit, we are clearly not seeing activities that we consider to be high risk, Mark, or certainly not high enough risk for us to consider taking enforcement action. And indeed, actually, if it's lower than 10%, as the figures seem to suggest, then we're not even having a conversation saying, have you thought about doing that? So for many, we're only doing that with about 10%. So that does suggest it's a little bit blown up, if you like, to be a bigger worry for farmers, I fear, than it actually possibly needs to be. But yes, in terms of having a chat, that would be useful for us too, because I think what the RPS did do was flag that, if you like, our intelligence of what's actually happening on the ground and how we could offer advice and clarity was not as good as it could have been. And I think it would actually help us understand a bit more what's happening in a general way, not in a kind of, we're going to target you for an inspection kind of way, if you see what I mean.
Sam, I wonder if that allays your fears that the industry interpretation is actually correct, does it? Or does it not?
Well, obviously, I'm very confident that the industry interpretation is correct. Whilst I'm not a lawyer, I think probably people can understand that I wouldn't say this if I didn't have some advice behind it. I mean, I'm not really allowed to share any of that because of legal privilege, but I am obviously also on the industry working group, and at that first industry working group, the farming representative organisations, one by one, basically stated that they didn't agree with the Environment Agency interpretation as they understood it, and I can only think that they would say that if they had their own legal advice, which again I'm not party to. So I think there is a weight of legal opinion in favour of the industry interpretation. I don't just say it as my own. It's pretty clear that it's more widespread than that. I think one point on that as well is we've talked a lot about nitrate, but actually the focus of these regulations was supposed to be on phosphate and sediment according to the impact assessment. There would be a question, of course, of whether an application of base phosphate fertiliser in the autumn would be legal, given that the crop wouldn't use it till spring, particularly a spring crop like, say, potatoes. So we've talked a lot about applying in the autumn being banned, but actually manufactured phosphate or mined phosphate in the autumn would also be banned under the interpretation that the Environment Agency has laughably adopted at the moment. So just to give people a bit of backup that maybe there is something slightly amiss with the Environment Agency interpretation there.
Okay. Well, we're all hoping that the working group will manage to alleviate perhaps some of the issues that I think have arisen over over the summer on the back of this, because I do think that the ability to, as you alluded to, Sam, I think the practical ability to be able to apply organic manures in the winter, the downside of having to apply them in the spring and the damage to soil and the lack of available spreading days to do that needs to be something that is addressed pretty quickly. Because if we don't get this communication about it being more of a, as you're saying, Kevin, a sort of a risk-based approach, and you're not seeking to ban it, then you may have inadvertently set a hare running, which is that people are reluctant to take biosolids or indeed apply digestates or worry about what they're going to do with their farmyard manure next summer, and that might have some unintended consequences, I think.
Yeah, Mark.
We've just got a couple. Sorry, Kevin. Sorry.
Oh no, just on the biosolids point. So we were able to send a letter to the water companies immediately. The RPS effectively gave what we think we needed, which was legal cover, to be able to send a letter out to the water companies, which they were then able to share with all of the farmers that they enter into contracts with. I think it's 3.6 million tonnes that they apply every year. So we're currently in conversations with them about things like what kind of flexibility will be required next year too. So we're trying to get in earlier this year, because a lot of this didn't happen. It happened far too late, obviously, and it was a bit of a mad panic at the worst possible time.
3 years too late.
Well, I don't take full blame, do I, Sam, for the fact that it was late? You know.
Well, to be fair, I mean, I joined after this push for the RPS, so I don't know the veracity of that. But I'm happy.
Thank you. I'm glad you accept that.
Well, I accept it. I certainly I think the NFU would have pushed for it, but I don't know. I'm not sure whether the MPA would have made any statement at all.
I won't share my inbox. I don't want to embarrass anybody.
Kevin, I'm just going to pick up on one. I think you alluded earlier, I think it was yourself, it may have been Sam, I may be misinterpreting or saying it wrong, but to the ability of working with the transition programme. James Hadwin, one of our members, asked, says the cost of extra winter storage is increasing, as are all our costs. Are the environment aware of these costs and the level of increase, and can they encourage DEFRA to support farmers to achieve the regulations with realistic capital work? Farmers are coming under pressure from all angles in terms of regulation, and the reduction in direct support and additional cost is causing stress to many. And this is just another example, but what influence and what ability do you think you have within DEFRA to encourage them to enable people to provide, increased winter storage, if that's what needs to be the outcome of this?
Yeah, Mark, I'm really glad that question was asked. We've been pushing DEFRA for infrastructure investment to be part of the agricultural transition plan for almost as long as I've been enrolled, so for about the last 4 years now. Absolutely support the need for investment, absolutely support the right options in ELMS, which could actually help in terms of some of the mitigation land management elements that could protect the water environment while enabling some of these activities to go on too. We know that there was mention of a slurry investment grant, wasn't there? I think when the agricultural transition plan was first launched, it was buried somewhere in the small print. I think there will be further news from DEFRA around that in early 2022. We're certainly staying very close to that. And I really think the opportunity of the working group is actually that there can be a joint EA industry message that this is what's needed. And I'd also say something else. There's 200,000 tonnes surplus of nitrates, which is coming in. We have in Britain. We're a net sink to 200,000 tonnes of nitrates. Now that's a sign to me, if I was in the industry and trying to make strategic arguments, that's a sign to me that actually pushes for more domestic production of food and more of a circular economy in terms of food and waste here in the UK. So there are lots of really powerful strategic arguments that the industry could make as part of this working group, I think, to push for investment and push for policies that will support the industry. Yeah,
I'm not sure whether that is entirely part of the remit of the working group. And of course, it's very difficult for you within the civil service to make that case. So, I mean, I'm happy to hear you do so, but obviously there's a role for farming organisations, including the TFA, to help campaign for those proper funding from DEFRA independently from the Environment Agency, because obviously naturally those organisations can lobby in a way that the Environment Agency could never actually do. So, I mean, one thing we're obviously undone by is a colossal increase in the raw material price to make those infrastructure investments. And obviously, the one thing I would hope is whether DEFRA could review the rate at which it might partially fund those. Obviously, there is some return on those investments, but they're over a very long term. And if DEFRA could possibly raise the rate at which it helps fund those improvements, then I think that would be something that would be really welcomed by industry.
Yeah, absolutely, Sam. I think I could definitely agree with that. I'm a little bit conscious of time, and as usual with my ineffectual timekeeping, we haven't kept quite to the schedule. I think that's partly because really grateful to both Sam and Kevin for coming on this evening, and I think raising quite a lot of issues, having a pretty, I think, a good discussion from both sides of the fence, if you like, as to where we go. I wonder if both of you would just like to give a sort of closing comment on where you think this will all go next, or where perhaps it should go next, or maybe where it will go. That might be a different answer. Sam.
Well, okay, I'll go first. I mean, to be fair, Dr. Austin is throwing a massive googly that I was not aware of in this legal challenge. That may pause things. It may pause the industry working group. I wasn't aware that it was coming. I was hoping that legal actions would be avoided. That is likely to throw a total spanner in the works, delay the whole thing. Unfortunately, I can't see particularly good things coming out of it. I mean, apart from upholding the view that I hold, but it still means that it still leaves the fundamental question of water quality. And as Dr. Austin was alluding to, there may be good things which could have come out of the working group. That's probably under threat, or at least postponed, pending that, unfortunately. So we may well find that we are in the same position next year as we are now, hopefully with an improved and more workable RPS for next year. But I do worry about that piece of news you've just dropped on us.
Well, at the moment, it's a notification of intent, Sam, which is like the first stage, if you like.
I should say it wasn't me who submitted this.
No, it wasn't you. It's a notification of intent. It might still be possible to head it off. I agree with you. I think there's a huge opportunity, actually, for the working group to come up with a better way forward. And there is a risk it could slightly stall the work. But I also would agree with Sam, going forward next year, one way or the other, whatever's happening in the legal space, we want to get really clear guidance and communications out to farmers. We want to ensure we've got measures in place which are practical, whether that's some kind of regulatory position statement, or whether by then we're in a position to know we can change, we have a different approach. I don't know, but one way or the other, we'll come up with a sensible approach, while also, of course, tackling those areas that represent the highest risk to water, because we have got that as our regulatory duty, and where we're actually seeing pollution occurring, we will obviously intervene.
Brilliant. Thanks very much to both Sam and to Kevin. I am conscious we've run over the hour. I'm also conscious that Zoom and Teams meetings are quite difficult to maintain a concentration for much more than an hour. So apologies to anybody who's gone for tea already. But I'm really grateful to both of you. I think that's been a really interesting and useful debate. There is quite a lot to come out on this, and I think it's really important that between the industry and the Environment Agency, we come up with a practical solution for how this works, because it has, I think, quite big implications for both sides, really. And it would be a shame if we lose the opportunity to be applying organic manures. So, or that people assume that they can't apply organic manures. So I think there's a lot to go through on this. I think hopefully the working group and the Environment Agency will be able to pull something together. We also weren't aware of any legal challenge, so that was news to us as well. George just told me. So well, I guess we'll see where that goes. So once again, thank you both very much for taking your time and coming and presenting to us. Apologies to those members who have put some questions on the Q&A that, as ever, I've failed to get around to. We will maybe ask Kevin if we emailed one or two whether we could get the answers to one or two for you, and if we can, we will do. Just again, a big thank you to Barclays for sponsoring this series of webinars, and a reminder that the next upcoming sessions we've got on the 27th of October, there's a members virtual surgery around succession. This is almost full. It's not recorded. It's a more sort of tight-knit event. There are a few places left, Julia tells me. So if you want to contact Julia at head office, either by email, events@tfa.org.uk, or on the main office number, you can book you on. And the next one of these webinars is on Tuesday, the 17th of November, around business planning in the new farming environment for the tenanted sector. I might be jumping the gun, but we're hoping that there may have been a little bit more detail on Elms by then. So whether Adam White, who's the head of agriculture at Barclays, will be able to tell us about that and how it affects our businesses, time will tell. So thank you all very much. I'll let you all go and get your tea or a beer or do whatever you want to do at 8 o'clock on a Tuesday night. And thank you very much for attending, and we look forward to seeing you at the future events.